1633, the most powerful scientific mind in Europe was forced to his knees. Galileo Galilei knelt before the Pope and recanted everything he had discovered. He denied the truth he had proven with his own eyes through his own telescope. Why would the man who invented modern astronomy betray his life's work? Because the alternative was torture. This is not a story about science. It is a story about power, fear, and one man's impossible choice between his truth and his life. And it begins with a telescope that changed everything. Galileo Galilei was born in Pisa, Italy, in 1564, the eldest son of Vincenzo Galilei, a musician and composer who struggled his entire life to make a living. His mother, Julia, was difficult and demanding, a woman whose sharp tongue and impossible standards would shape Galileo's entire character. From his earliest childhood, Galileo learned that survival meant working harder than anyone else, speaking louder than anyone expected, and never accepting the easy answer. His father's career was a constant humiliation, a talented musician who lived on the margins of society, never quite accepted by the aristocracy that commissioned his work. Galileo watched his father's frustration and made a silent vow. He would not live this way. He would not beg for scraps. He would become indispensable. He was not the son destined for greatness by birth. He was the son who had to prove himself every single day, in every way, against impossible odds. When Galileo enrolled at the University of Pisa at 17 to study medicine, he was bored within weeks. The medical theories of the time were based on ancient texts written 2,000 years earlier by Galen and Hippocrates. Nobody questioned these texts, nobody tested them. They were simply accepted as truth because they were old and because powerful people believed them. Galileo found this infuriating. The human body, he thought, was less interesting than the stars. He abandoned his medical studies and taught himself mathematics in secret, spending nights studying Euclid and contemplating the movements of celestial bodies. His father was furious. He had invested money and reputation into his son's medical education, and Galileo was throwing it away on mathematics, a subject that promised no wealth, no status, no future. But Galileo had already made his choice. He would become a mathematician, even if the world was not ready for him, even if his own family abandoned him. By the time Galileo was 25 years old, he had discovered something that would make him famous across Italy: the law of falling bodies. While observing the chandelier swinging in the Cathedral of Pisa after a service, he realized something profound. The time it took for the chandelier to swing did not change as it swung smaller and smaller. This led him to a revolutionary conclusion. Objects fall at the same speed regardless of their weight. This seemed impossible. Common sense said a heavy rock should fall faster than a feather. Every person who had ever dropped two objects knew this was true. But Galileo understood something most people did not. Common sense was not the same as truth. He had to prove it. According to legend, he climbed the Leaning Tower of Pisa in 1589 and dropped objects of different weights from the top. They landed at the same moment. The crowd below gasped. But more importantly, Galileo gasped too. He had proven something nobody believed. He had challenged Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of antiquity, and shown that Aristotle was wrong. And he had tasted the power of challenging the world. Nothing would ever taste the same again. This discovery brought him recognition, but not wealth. Universities invited him to lecture, but they did not offer him positions. He became a tutor to wealthy families, traveling from city to city, teaching mathematics to bored sons of merchants and nobles. It was a humbling existence for a man with his ambitions. Galileo wanted respect. He wanted security. He wanted to be recognized not as a tutor, but as a thinker equal to the great philosophers of ancient Greece. By his early 40s, he seemed destined to remain forever on the margins of the academic world, respected by students, ignored by institutions. He was in his mid-40s when everything changed. In 1609, he heard rumors from Venice. A Dutch inventor had created a strange new device. It was a tube with glass on both ends. When you looked through it, distant objects appeared close. The device was called a telescope. Within weeks, Galileo had built his own, not by copying the Dutch design, but by understanding the principles of optics and improving on the original idea. His telescope was 3 times more powerful than the Dutch version. But unlike the Dutch inventor who saw a commercial opportunity, Galileo understood something crucial. This device was not just a toy or a merchant's tool. It was a window into the cosmos. He pointed it at the night sky and looked up. What he saw changed him forever. The moon was not smooth and perfect, as the Church taught in its doctrine of celestial perfection. It was covered in mountains and valleys, scarred and broken like Earth itself. Those mountains cast shadows. He measured them. The moon's highest peaks rose nearly a mile into its sky. This was not heaven. This was a world, rough, imperfect, damaged. Jupiter had not 4 moons orbiting it, but 4 moons that revealed something shocking and impossible. Not everything revolved around Earth. These Galilean moons, as they would come to be called, orbited Jupiter continuously. They did not circle the Earth. The Sun itself had dark spots moving across its surface. The Milky Way was not a cloudy river of light. It was millions upon millions of stars too distant to see with the naked eye, each one a potential sun with potential worlds around it. Every observation contradicted what the Church insisted was absolute truth. Galileo was not just discovering new worlds, he was destroying the old one. He was proving that the Bible, as interpreted by the Church, was wrong about the nature of creation itself. He published his findings in 1610 in a book called The Starry Messenger. The book became an instant sensation across Europe. Copies circulated from Paris to Prague to Rome. Galileo was no longer an unknown professor struggling on the margins. He was the man who had seen farther than any human in recorded history. He was the man who had revealed the true nature of the heavens. Princes wanted him at their courts. Universities invited him to lecture. The Pope himself seemed interested in his work. Urban Fee, who was Cardinal Barberini at the time, sent Galileo congratulations and invited him to Rome. Galileo felt safe. He believed that truth would protect him. He believed that the Church, as an institution dedicated to understanding God's creation, would ultimately embrace scientific truth. He was catastrophically wrong. He had misunderstood how power works. Truth does not protect you when you challenge the foundation of institutional power. The problem was simple but deadly. Galileo's observations supported a theory that the Church had forbidden. A Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus had suggested decades earlier that the Sun, not Earth, was the center of the solar system. This was not a minor disagreement about astronomical details. This was a fundamental challenge to the Christian worldview. If Earth was not the center of creation, then humanity was not special. If we were not special, then what did it mean to be made in God's image? If we were not the center of the universe, then perhaps our souls were not the center of God's concern either. The implications were theological and existential. The Church had rejected Copernicanism completely. It was heresy. It contradicted Scripture. God had placed humanity at the center of creation. The Psalms said so. Genesis said so. The entire Bible was written from the perspective of humanity's centrality. To suggest otherwise was to insult God himself and to destabilize the entire religious foundation of Christian Europe. When Galileo's observations supported Copernicus, He had unknowingly crossed an invisible line. He had not just made a scientific discovery, he had committed a theological crime. The Vatican did not just disagree with his science. They saw him as a threat to Christianity itself. Religious authorities feared that if educated people began to doubt the Church's understanding of the cosmos, they might begin to doubt other Church teachings. If the Church was wrong about the heavens, could they be wrong about salvation, about morality, about the nature of God? The threat was existential. In 1615, the Church summoned Galileo to Rome. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, one of the Church's most powerful and intelligent theologians, delivered a message with absolute clarity. Galileo could continue his scientific work. He could continue his studies, but he could never again advocate for heliocentrism, the idea that the sun was the center of the solar system. He could study it as a mathematical hypothesis, but not promote it as truth. He could not teach it. He could not write about it as fact. Galileo agreed. He thought he could work within these boundaries. He believed he could be both a brilliant scientist and a faithful Catholic. He believed he could navigate between two worlds. He was wrong. Years passed in frustrated silence. Galileo wanted to publish his ideas. He felt the truth burning inside him like a caged fire. He was brilliant, and the world was asking him to pretend to be less than he was. He was living a lie. Then, in 1623, something remarkable happened. Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, Galileo's old friend and defender, was elected pope and took the name Urban V. Barberini had been friendly with Galileo for years. He was more educated than previous popes and seemed more open to new ideas. He was a poet, a patron of the arts, a man of Renaissance sensibilities. Galileo saw an opportunity. He wrote a letter to Urban asking permission to publish a new book discussing both the Copernican system and the traditional Ptolemaic system. Urban gave permission, with one condition. The book could not conclude that the sun was the center. It had to present both ideas as equally valid possibilities. It had to show that the Church's interpretation was one reasonable position among others. Galileo agreed. He had a plan. In 1632, he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. The book was brilliant, witty, and devastating. It presented three characters in conversation: Salviati, an intelligent supporter of heliocentrism; Simplicio, a defender of the traditional geocentric model; and Sagredo, a neutral observer. On the surface, it seemed balanced and fair. Both sides were presented, but anyone reading carefully understood the truth. Salviati was eloquent and right. Simplicio was an intellectual fool who repeated tired arguments, and the old system was absurd when examined closely. The Pope read it and felt betrayed. Urban had trusted Galileo. Urban had given him permission based on Galileo's promise to present both systems fairly. But Galileo had done exactly the opposite. He had presented heliocentrism as obviously correct, and geocentrism as the position of fools. The Pope was not just angry. He was humiliated in front of his own court. He had been made to look foolish for trusting a man who had secretly mocked his conditions. In 1633, at 70 years old, Galileo was summoned to Rome again. This time, it was not an invitation. It was a summons backed by the full power of the Inquisition. He was accused of heresy. The trial lasted 4 months. Galileo was interrogated repeatedly. The Church presented evidence that Galileo had violated the 1615 ban on promoting heliocentrism. Galileo argued that he had followed the Pope's instructions. He argued that his book presented both systems, but his argument could not overcome the political reality. The Pope felt betrayed, and the Church needed to make an example. They needed to show that even famous scientists, Even friends of the Pope could not challenge church authority with impunity. On June 22, 1633, Galileo was brought before the Inquisition for his final interrogation. He was told to recant. He was told to renounce heliocentrism and admit that the Earth was the center of the solar system. He was told to deny everything his eyes had seen through his telescope. He was told to deny his own mind, and he did. At 70 years old, blind and broken by the interrogations, Galileo knelt before the church and said the words they demanded. He recanted. He denied heliocentrism. He admitted his error. He promised to never again promote the heliocentric theory. He promised to abandon his life's work. The words came out of his mouth like poison from a dying snake. Whether he actually whispered, "E per si muove," and yet it moves, as he stood up from kneeling, is uncertain. The legend may be apocryphal, but the sentiment was real. Galileo knew the truth. The entire educated world knew the truth, but the church had won, or so they thought. Galileo's sentence was imprisonment for life, but the Pope, perhaps out of lingering respect or political calculation, allowed him to serve his sentence under house arrest in his villa in Arcetri, near Florence. The villa was beautiful but isolated. For the final 9 years of his life, Galileo was a prisoner in his own home. He was forbidden to receive visitors without permission. He was forbidden to leave his property. He was forbidden to discuss his work or his ideas. His blindness deepened with age. His hearing failed. His health deteriorated. The man who had opened humanity's eyes to the cosmos was now trapped in darkness, silenced and forgotten, abandoned by the scientific community that feared the church's power more than they valued truth. Former students and colleagues who had celebrated him now avoided him. To associate with Galileo was to risk the church's suspicion. But even in his prison, Galileo could not stop thinking. Even blind, he could not stop seeing with his mind. He began to write in secret. He dictated his thoughts to his student Evangelista Torricelli, who smuggled the manuscript pages out of Italy, hidden in clothing and secret compartments. In 1638, after years of careful work conducted in shadow and silence, a book was published in Holland, beyond the reach of the church. It was called Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences. In this book, written by a blind old man under house arrest, Galileo did something revolutionary. He laid the foundation for modern physics itself. He described the laws of motion, acceleration, and inertia. He explained how projectiles travel through space. He calculated the mathematics of falling bodies with precision never before achieved. Every principle in this book would become the mathematical language of science itself. Isaac Newton would build on these ideas. Modern physics would be born from these concepts. Einstein would stand on these foundations. And it all came from a blind prisoner, writing in the dark, smuggling his thoughts out of Italy like contraband, knowing the church would never allow it to see the light of day. Galileo died on January 8, 1642, at the age of 77. His final days were spent in his villa, blind, nearly deaf, and completely isolated. The church did not allow a grand funeral befitting his genius. He was buried quietly in a small chapel in Florence, almost as an afterthought. His books remained on the list of forbidden works for nearly 200 years. The church would not officially apologize for his persecution until 1992, 359 years after his death. By then, his theories were not just accepted, they were foundational to human understanding. Every telescope pointed at the stars, every spacecraft launched into space, every understanding of our place in the cosmos, all of it could be traced directly back to a blind prisoner writing in the dark. Today, We remember Galileo not as a heretic or a recanter. We remember him as the father of modern science. We remember him because he proved something that goes beyond mathematics or astronomy. He proved that truth survives. He proved that no institution, no matter how powerful, can destroy an idea whose time has come. He proved that sometimes the most courageous act is not defiance, but survival, keeping the torchlight even when the darkness seems absolute and eternal. Galileo showed us that the price of truth can be everything: freedom, sight, recognition, peace, dignity, and the respect of your peers. And yet, he paid it. He paid it willingly, because his mind could not accept the lie. In doing so, he changed the world forever. The earth still moves. The sun still shines at the center of our solar system. And Galileo's legacy proves that light, once kindled, cannot be extinguished by any darkness, no matter how powerful that darkness appears to be. Galileo's story is one of thousands we have yet to tell. Throughout history, ordinary people did extraordinary things. They challenged the world. They paid impossible prices for their truth. They changed us forever, and yet we forget them. That is why Epic History Vault exists, to remember the people who shaped our world, to understand their struggles, and to learn from their courage. If Galileo's story moved you, if it made you think about the cost of truth and the power of the human spirit, then please subscribe to Epic History Vault. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next forgotten story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about Galileo, a friend, a family member, someone who is struggling with their own impossible choice. And if you have a story about a historical figure you think we should tell, leave a comment below. We read every single one. Thank you for joining us. The universe is vast, but the stories that connect us are infinite.